Hello. My name is Mark Mayer. I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and Programs here at the Asian Art Museum. And before I get into it, I wanted to make a little announcement. If anybody needs assisted listening devices, if you see my colleagues over there in the AV booth, they have them available for you. And so tonight's program concludes our 2019 Asian Architecture Today lecture series, and I wanted to welcome everyone to the Asian Art Museum, especially students and faculty at CCA. I also wanted to express my full gratitude to Keith Crumbly, the Dean of the Architecture Division, and Leah Kendall for making these three lectures possible in collaboration. And I wanted to just recognize how much I appreciate this partnership. We're fortunate tonight because we have the privilege of hosting Rahul Mehrotra for the lecture, Soft Thresholds, the work of RMA Architects. And in some ways, I'm joking that tonight is actually an encore performance of sorts. In 2016, Rahul came here as part of a program titled Mapping the Kumbh Mela, organized by the Society for Art and Cultural Heritage of India. And for months after this program, I kept on hearing from attendees that his presentation was wonderful, interesting, dynamic, and it was great to hear because I wasn't able to attend. And the other comments that I kept on hearing was that since this program focused on Rahul's research, the audience was super curious about what his architectural practice was like. And that kind of prompted a spark of an idea. So it proved to be a great opportunity to make this happen, and I also wanted to thank Lisa Finley for kind of processing this original suggestion. And so thank you all for coming again, and if we don't see you before next year's architecture lecture series, please come join us in 2020. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over.
Hi, welcome. I'm Keith Crumbly, the Dean of the Architecture Division at CCA, and I want to express my thanks to Mark and the team here at the Asian Art Museum for making this just an amazing season. We did 3 lectures here this semester, the 3rd season in the Asian Architecture Today series that was initiated, I suppose, by Dean Jonathan Massey and sustained last year beautifully by Interim Dean Lisa Finley. I also want to thank my team at CCA, Leah Kendall, Jared Elizaris, Dustin Smith, my chairs, my faculty. It's just an amazing group of people to work with. It's my honor tonight to introduce Rahul Mehrotra, who I met for the first time today. Sadly, it took until this point in my life to meet Rahul, whose work I've always admired and research I've always admired. I don't have a really sweet backstory like Mark did. But I'm really privileged, I'm really happy that he couldn't make it last year, so he could be here this year. Rahul's a practicing architect and urban designer and professor of urban design and planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he also serves as the director of the urban design program. Previously served as chair of the planning and urban planning program, I believe. In 1990, he founded RMA Architects based in Boston and Mumbai. The office has designed and executed a wide range of projects, including government and private institutions, corporate, workplaces, private homes, and unsolicited projects driven by the firm's commitment to advocacy in the city of Mumbai. In 2018, RMA Architects was awarded the Venice Architecture Biennial Jury's special mention for 3 projects that address issues of intimacy and empathy, gently diffusing social boundaries and hierarchies. Soft thresholds. Professor Mehrotra has been involved in civic and urban affairs in Mumbai, having served on government commissions for the conservation of historic buildings and environmental issues with various neighborhood groups. From 1994 to 2004, served as executive director of the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai. He's also written and lectured extensively on issues to do with architecture, conservation, and urban planning and design in Mumbai and in India. His writings include co-authoring Bombay, The Cities Within, which covers the city's urban history from the 1600s to the present, Banganga, forgive my pronunciation occasionally, Banganga, Sacred Tank, Public Places Bombay, Anchoring a City Line, a history of the city's commuter railways, and Bombay to Mumbai, Changing Perspectives. He's also co-authored Conserving an Image Center, the Fort Precinct in Bombay, and based on that study and its recommendations, the historic Fort District in Mumbai was declared a conservation precinct in 1995, the first such designation in all of India. In 2000, he edited a book for the Union of International Architects titled The Architecture of the 20th Century in the South Asian Region. In 2011, Professor Mehrotra wrote Architecture in India Since 1990, a study of contemporary architecture in India. This was extended through an exhibition he co-curated titled The State of Architecture, Practices and Processes in India at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai in January 2016, and was followed in 2018 by the exhibition The State of Housing, Realities, Aspirations, and Imaginaries in India. In 2012 to 2015, he led a Harvard University-wide research project with Professor Diana Eck called the Kumbh. Is that correct, Rahul? Mapping the ephemeral megacity, and we heard a little bit about that project today at CCA. We had the privilege of hosting Rahul over at the school with Urban Works Agency, one of our amazing research labs, and a group of our students in Niraj Bhatia's studio. The work of that project was published in a book in 2014, and his recent research the research was extended in 2017 in the form of a book titled Does Permanence Matter? And also resulted in an invited exhibition at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennial. So he spends a lot of time in Mumbai and apparently a lot of time in Venice. Professor Mehrotra's latest co-authored book is titled Taj Mahal, Multiple Narratives, which was published in December 2017. His research on urbanism is focused on evolving a theoretical framework for designing in conditions of informal growth, which he refers to as the kinetic city. He has run several studios looking at various aspects of planning questions in the city of Mumbai under the rubric Extreme Urbanism. His current research is on the small towns and emerging urban conglomerations in India and is expected to be published as a book in the fall of this year. Join me in welcoming Rahul Mehrotra.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Keith, Mark, the faculty of the CCA, and many friends. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be back here again, so thank you. So today, what I'm going to do is share with you, I think Keith sort of outlined a whole lot of research projects, and I was going to not include them, but then Mark suggested if it does influence your practice, do talk about them. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes actually talking about some of the research, albeit really briefly, because these are lectures in themselves, and then share 6 or 7 projects with you, which I hope you'll be able to make some of these sort of connections. So Mumbai, where I work, is an interesting city because here, architecture is not even the spectacle of the city. It's not the instrument by which a city is organized. It's festivals like this that become the spectacle of the city here. This great Ganesh immersion at the end of 10 days of worship, where the memory of the city becomes an enacted process, because when the clay idol dissolves in the water, it sort of washes away the memory to be enacted the following year. So again, architecture gets challenged here. I call this the kinetic city, as Keith sort of referred to in the introduction. And this is a city which is continuously adjusting. Here, the city is not about grand vision, it's about grand adjustment, So this diagram, I think, captures it. It's called the 5 stages of squatting. These guys in the image are the 3rd stage of squatting. So they start off, they set up something, and slowly this grows. By the time the summer comes, you have a canopy. At the monsoon, you get fortified, and then you become part of the landscape. And the whole city grows with these accretions. Now, this is diametrically opposite to this, which I call the landscapes of impatient capital, because capital is intrinsically impatient, and the territories the terrains that allow capital to land frictionless and realize its value instantly, Dubai, Shanghai, all those landscapes of autocracy that we celebrate are the landscapes and the cities of impatient capital, right? Exemplified at its height right here, this is Donald Trump's new tower in Mumbai. It's gilded in gold, it's gold-plated. Believe it or not, gold leaf in parts, panels in gold, sitting in a landscape with such iniquity. And this is the Trump card. And it's quite sort of opposite to this, which is highly pluralistic. And I was sharing with the students this morning that, the folks living in buildings like that are probably engaged in much more severe informal economic activity, whereas these guys are often employed in formal jobs. So there's a complete blurring of this otherwise what we imagine as clear binary that's posed and sort of manifest in architecture. So this kind of gets challenged. And so the kinds of questions that emerge here are questions of equity and social justice. How do you deal with this when capital creates these sort of landscapes of autonomy that have very little to do with even the place? But, you know, equity or questions like that don't only have a quantitative measure, I believe, because finally we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes us instrumental as or agents of change or transformation as designers? Because I think even equity has a subjective dimension, and that of access. And even an illusion of equity is a step in the right direction because it engages you with empathy and it opens up. And thus, sort of this notion of how does architecture create soft thresholds that allow porosities and engagement versus separate communities? And I'll come back to this project later in the lecture, but at this moment I want to quote Martha Chen. She is one of, I think, the leading authorities on the informal economy at the Kennedy School of Government. And what she has said in the context of economy, I borrow for architecture and cities. And to quote Martha Chen, she says, what is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players. And how does architecture and urban design become part of this project? And so, by extension, really the discussion, for example, about sustainability comes down to, in at least the way I understand it, a chemical or a mechanical fix to a problem perpetuated by certain architectural paradigms. You know, we're talking about more efficient insulation, better fans, sealants for windows, etc. And again, I'll come back to that when we come to this project. So the crucial questions, I think, that are absent have to do with spatial arrangements and society. How do we make space a social condenser, an armature to foster and facilitate social connections, not create hard thresholds that separate? So here the human dimension, at least in my observation about the discussion about sustainability, is totally absent, and I think that is really frightening. So I'm going to now move into sharing with you some of this research that Keith sort of kindly referred to. I'll go through this really quickly so that we can then get to the projects. So one is, of course, zooming out completely at the urban level, and this is the new research that he was alluding to, just asking the question, what is even urban? Because like we have to dissolve the binaries that I just sort of listed, even the rural-urban binary is a highly problematic one in today's world in a country like India. I don't believe it even exists. And here's why. So the three criteria that we use in India to define officially what a town is, and by extension it gets a municipality, it begins to get a government, it gets funding, infrastructure, hospital, a clinic, a school, in a formal system, these are the three criteria that we use, which is it has to have a population of over 5,000 people. Most Italian towns that we admire are much less than that. It has to have a density of over 400 persons per square kilometer. Greater Houston is about 280 per square kilometer. Over 75% of its male population has to be in non-agricultural employment. How bizarre. How would you even calculate that? It doesn't make any sense. But this becomes the lens or the filter by which towns are defined to become, whether they become towns or not. And by these parameters, we have 7,200 or 7,258 towns, or some such number. That's kind of bizarre. So we're trying to spatialize this, and when you spatialize this, it's interesting. This is how urbanization in India is projected if you use this sort of these big and small dots. That's how we see urbanization. If you look at 5,000 people as a criteria, that is urban India. You get a completely different pixelation of how this plays out. If you look at the density, you get the world's biggest megacity right here. This is the world's biggest megacity because it has densities of actually 1,000 people a square kilometer, much higher than even the bottom threshold. It's continuous urbanization along all of these sort of zones. And people who know India know Kerala is continuously urban. But if you use the 75% criteria, this megacity is not even urban, it's rural. So what does that mean? So these are incredible contradictions, and our policies are based on these readings, which are bizarre. And if you began to use this as your reading, you would deploy a completely different policy. So essentially, the thesis we are building is India is 60% urban for 6 months of the year and 40% urban for the other 6 months of the year, which means that is 300 million people who are in a state of flux. So what are we designing for? Because our cities then have to become elastic, they have to become kinetic, they have to accommodate that flux as a transitionary means. So therefore the question then for designers becomes, how do you design for this transition? And it is in this context that this project that Keith referred to, which I spoke about here the last time, was about the Kumbh Mela, and I got interested in this for that reason. It was a very interesting interdisciplinary project because you had to bring different disciplines to understand this wicked problem. It's a festival which accommodates 7 million people for 55 days at the confluence of these rivers, and another 120 million people visit it. So it's the world's largest congregation. That's what the city looks like. It's the world's lightest ephemeral megacity. It touches the ground without any foundations, just on the sandbanks. It's built in a matter of 10 weeks and dismantled in a week, from a watery terrain to an entire city of 7 million people, which is massive. In the world today, there are 50 cities over 5 million people. So in that context, this is massively humongous. And that's what it looks like. I mean, it replicates everything of a regular city. Even the governance is ephemeral and temporary. It switches. There's no hierarchy that stays static for more than 3 months in the process of 1 year when the city is imagined. And that research then we extended to look at flux across the globe in transactions, for religion, for military, for refugee, for extraction, etc. And that resulted in this book, which Felipe Vera and Jose, who's in the audience, was part of this project. And I think that here the idea was to kind of challenge the conversation about urban design and urban planning on 2 or 3 levels. One is infect it with this idea of elasticity and flux and how urban design and planning might react to it. The other was ask a very simple question: are we today as a society making permanent solutions for what might be temporary problems? And so therefore the question of transition becomes important. I think across the globe, if you look at the way demography is moving, transition is the key thing. How do we make this transition? How do we make the urban transition? How do we make the rural, the agriculture, all these transitions? So what I've spoken to you so far about is the spheres of our concern. These are things we are concerned with. We talk about climate change, poverty, equity, inequity. But the sphere of our influence is actually really minimal. So therefore the challenge becomes, how do we make these two intersections? How do we make the sphere of our concerns, which are so ambitious, rightly so, intersect with the sphere of our influence? And I think that becomes really going forward the fundamental challenge for both pedagogy, but also for us as practitioners. And for me here, as part of the practice, writing, publications, popularizing these questions has been very critical. And today with the students, I was talking about this. As you know, we don't have to always engage with advocacy per se as we imagine advocacy planning. We can also engage with producing the instruments for advocacy, which are very useful for advocates. They're useful for society. And so these books are a whole range, which are all the way from walking tours to more scholarly books, to more documentary books, to catalogs. It's a whole range of things. And some of them play out. So this is the range within that on Mumbai. So these go from, walking tours, as you see, or the history of the railways, as you look at here. This is on a specific building to get World Heritage listing. This is a history, Art Deco, Banganga, which Keith referred to. And in this case, it led to legislation. And again, this is a lecture in itself, but the process of creating these instruments for advocacy in this case was critical, but not only organizing legislation, but also going on the ground and then beginning to look at specific buildings as this one here. We've recently done some interventions because you're beginning to now understand a much broader context. And this is a visitor center at the Prince of Wales Museum. And so this sort of brings me to this idea that if you're looking at the spheres of concern and the sphere of influence and trying to make them intersect, then another useful way to see it is, as my colleague Neil Brenner framed it, is what is the context of the context that you're operating in? How do you nestle the context as we understand it as architects of place, of material, deeper excavations, if some of us are more ambitious, and intersect that with the context that you sit in, which is a context that's made by other meta-narratives which have to do with aesthetics, which have to do with globalization and its effects. It informs your work better if you can make those intersections. And so coming specifically to architecture, these are books now on architecture. This looked at architecture in South Asia. And this was a book which was done more recently where I really looked at architecture in India since 1990, since we liberalized our economy and what that meant. And that led to an exhibition on the state of architecture in India. And of course, these are lectures in themselves, as I said, but there are a couple of observations just to kind of share with you the sorts of things that we could extract from here. So if you look at this graph here, I'm sorry if you can't see this blue line. This is a blue line that's going up there, which shows from 1992 the growth of the organized sector of real estate. And what you see that's very interesting is that in India from independence, when there were 2 schools of architecture, at this point we have 428 schools of architecture. And they grow exponentially from the time real estate gets organized as a sector. And so therefore, the narrative that gets developed is there's a great demand for architects. Parents driving around with their kids in the back seat say, you must study architecture, look at the amount being built. But actually, when real estate gets organized as a sector, the demand for architects, it's inversely proportionate to the growth of real estate because it becomes an organized sector. One developer builds 40,000 homes using 2 architects in large gated communities, where you would have had 2,000 architects involved if you had a low-rise, high-density kind of housing neighborhood. So housing becomes really critical how we imagine it. So there are many disjunctures like this which emerged as a result of this exercise. And therefore, again, I see this as instruments of advocacy, which can then hopefully inform the Council of Architects, the Indian Institute of Architects, to alter their policies for many aspects of education. And that led to this exhibition on housing, which is much more specific, because I felt also that architects are being marginalized with the private sector getting into real estate with housing. So all of this led me to also ask this question. We often talk about the practice of architecture, but what is the architecture of practice? What is the structure by which we engage as a practice with the world outside? Do we make the instruments of advocacy part of our practice? Is research embedded, or is always seen as something that's peripheral and informs it? And so an observation that also came out of this, and this is the last piece of sort of observation I'm going to share with you before I start showing you projects, is that, we also look at the client, and this has to do with the architecture of practice. What is a model of practice? We look at clients as this sort of very unified entity. But actually, if you unpack it, a client is composed of a patron, an operational client, and a user. These are all clients. We often, if you're doing a campus building, for example, or a master plan for a campus, you're working with the operational clients, and you often don't have access to the president who might give the brief to the sometimes the president of the university deals with you, who is the patron, who defines the aspirations. The operational clients are the campus architects who are looking at this very pragmatically. They're delivering something in terms of budgets and time and all of that, and the users are the students. We don't traverse this whole spectrum often robustly enough, and I think that leads to all sorts of frustrations. And so one has become aware in the last few projects we've done is that creating feedback loops between these 3 constituencies makes a huge difference, and it actually informs the way you construct the architecture of your practice. And I think models could potentially come out of this with great discussion. To segue into projects, this is Mumbai, and all of us who start practices, and I did 30 years ago, was with weekend homes, things that were peripheral to people's lives, not intrinsic to their everyday existence. And so we did a number of weekend houses. And this is how they kind of get built. I mean, this is the Palladian villa, and that is the courtyard house, which gets its identity from the center. The symmetry is obtained from the center around the courtyard, not from the outsides, which is what a Palladian villa does. So the traditional Indian courtyard house is an inside-out version of the Palladian villa, and therefore, because the symmetry is gained from the outside, it has to become an autonomous object, versus the courtyard house, which gains, it's the space within that identifies it. But what gets built largely on the outskirts of Mumbai for the weekend houses, places like Alibag, is stuff like that. I always tell the story. I met the contractor who was building this house on the boat going across the harbor, and I asked him, like, who's designing this house? Because this is for a famous woman pop star. And he said, no one's designing it. I said, are you just building this? He said, yeah, she just gave me a picture of the White House in Washington and said, copy it. And so that's what I did. So that's kind of a version of that. And so here architecture actually polarizes the environment, because this is not only alien, it's a hard threshold. There's beware of dog signs, there's barbed wire, if you can see it on top of this is polarizing the environment, because these are rich people from Mumbai who go and build outside Mumbai, where it's actually quite poor. I wouldn't call it rural because it's on the edge of the city, but there's poverty. And it creates kind of a polarization in society, and this is what I mean with how architecture gets co-opted in this process of separation. And so this is a house we did early in our practice for a young couple, a filmmaker, where what we decided was, they're going to be there for like 10 weekends, 12 weekends in the year. And so this is the living room, which is a large veranda, or it's a porch with light furniture, because the weather is very good when they go, otherwise they won't go there. And you move the furniture in and slide that barn door there, and this then becomes an offering to the local. So the housekeeper, the custodian of the house, who's from the local village, can actually use it. He sits there and does tuitions with his daughter, teaches her math, or I've seen a wedding happen there once. He entertains his friends there. It actually creates security for the place, but it softens the threshold, where it allows the locality to actually permeate the house itself. And this sort of dual coding, in a sense, I think has interesting potential. And it's not like you compromise the architecture. I mean, we spent a lot of time refining the plan. The water tap, this collects water. There's a well. The taps are accessible to the villagers because there's a problem of water often there. So again, that's an offering, because they don't need the surplus if they're going to be there only for a few days in the year. And so then architecture gets reconfigured with this social aspiration. And I think this idea of social architecture that's actually being branded today, in a sense, is ridiculous, because architecture by its nature is social. It's just that we've got to be aware or become more mindful of its possibilities and potential. And for me, this became a very important experiment. And then we went on recently to do a house for a young doctor who's very famous. He discovered drug-resistant TB and wanted to build a villa, and we went through the same exercise, close to getting that image of the White House. But we kind of said, look, there's a village encroaching upon your property. This is all going to become the expansion of the village. Eventually, when the village grows around you, the house should fit within the texture of the village and not stand out as this autonomous object. And so the thing we did was we disaggregated it. And here, it also became a research agenda for us, because we asked ourselves the question, how can you take incrementalism and apply it? We apply we say incremental housing, so it's sites and services. We kind of connect that strategy with poverty and with the poor. They can't afford it, so how will they grow their houses? So I said, look, let's use that strategy and experiment with a house for a rich person. So we disaggregated it, so even a middle-class person could have built one unit and added the pool when they could afford it, etc. And so for us, it became a bit of a research project, although we built it and we knew we were going to build it all together. So it's a living room, a dining, a kitchen, a courtyard. From the courtyard, you can go into the pool, kind of guest space, and 3 bedrooms for the family, which can become a big suite or it can become individual rooms. The pool being discreet was very critical, because I'll never forget, and for Californians, this might be amusing. One of the early houses we did, I had a client come in, and of course, we never named these clients, but a client came in and said, I want a weekend house. And I said, what should it be like? So she said, it should be like my friend Kitty's house. So I said, what's Kitty's house like? So she said, see, when I go to Kitty's house, I feel like I'm in California. And so, when we began to unpack that, we realized she wanted a pool with beach umbrellas, and, and that's exactly what actually happens. But in a context like this, where you have this disparity of income, cultures, sensibilities, this hedonism has to be more private. It can't be in your face, because there are also gardeners working here, toiling and, keeping the grass green and cutting leaves of trees that are rotting, etc. So that's why the pool is so discreet. And that's what it looks like as you approach it. That's what it looks like from the village. It's kind of really disaggregated in terms of form. It's material from the locality. And just the windows have been sort of expressed using copper. That's the pool, so you can swim there, and actually you get a glimpse of the garden, but it's completely private. You never actually see the water of the pool, and you go through these series of courtyards, very simple kinds of materials. And here with the pool, the green is also framed while yet being kind of discreet. And this is the suite, which can become a large room, very Japanese. The blinds go down if you want the privacy, so it expands visually. It's designed for the season, so even in the monsoon, it's a house that can be kind of enjoyed. And these sort of windows in colored glass kind of are a register for the day, because the colors and the color wash changes as the sun moves around the house, and that's the relationship with the outside. So moving to kind of institutional projects which get more complex, and this is the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad where I studied, designed by Doshi, and it was overwhelming to be asked to do the first non-Doshi building on the campus, which was a library they were planning, and being an alum, I was sort of invited. And here, this sort of relationship was very complex, because the patrons were the Ahmedabad Education Society that had patronized Corbusier, Louis Kahn, very aware of what they wanted, very high standards. The clients were all my colleagues. Many of them had been senior to me in school 5 and 6 years before I was kind of graduating. And the users were the students. And this was an amazing project it was the toughest project we've done. I was saying to my friend John Alf here earlier that usually in a project, you make a passionate presentation, and then the clients will look at each other if it's a couple, and they'll say, look, the service entrance is not big enough, make the kitchen counter a little longer. And you say, no problem, we'll do that. Here, I would make a passionate presentation, and my clients would say, we just don't agree with the way and the attitude you've taken with the way the building touches the ground. Now, that's not easy to say, I'll come back with a solution. It means you're starting all over again, and how do you even respond? So to have architects as clients is challenging, but also very difficult. Anyway, it involved many presentations with alums and, the usual thing that you do. We were given a footprint, which Christopher Benninger did for the master plan. We finally landed up doing the plaza. These are all existing buildings. And then this is a cafeteria we've done recently. And so we finally did a master plan for all of that. But we were stuck with this sort of building footprint. And for me, this was, in some ways, a conservation project. And a conservation project in that one was intervening in a modernist heritage campus. And that was difficult and, very important to be aware of that. But yet the challenge was, how does one not use the same palette of materials which don't have the same relevance today? It's not even economical. And how does one expose students to the contemporary materials that are available and that flood the market, and how you could use them more appropriately and strategically? And so that became really the project. But the most important thing was the brief required a 6-storied building, which was bizarre because I said it's a modernist sort of heritage. So we took Doshi's buildings and we forced ourselves to stay a centimeter below each of these buildings, or to relate them in a way that which meant that we had to basically go 3 floors into the ground. And that was a real challenge. And people often say, oh my God, you were of course inspired by the step dwells. And I say, no, I was just inspired by the fact that we had to go below the ground. But it was a real challenge to actually do that, both in terms of just the technical kind of challenges. So it became a building that was it was like these Chinese dolls, Japanese or Chinese dolls, nestled into each other, 3 buildings that collapsed into each other. One was a facade which regulated the climate above ground, a second facade which modulated light for the reading areas, and then a third building which were the book stacks that went into the ground, which you see here. And each of these buildings, the 3 buildings that nestle into each other, had a completely different sectional logic. So the building that was outside had 4.5 meter floor heights, the next had 3.5 meters, and the third had 2.4 meters, which is where the books were, because that's what you could reach very easily. But this did something interesting, which is it allowed you sectionally not to feel claustrophobic, and I'll show you that in a second. And this is a kind of courtyard so we bring natural light all the way down 3 floors, which is, these are floors of 4.5 meters, so you're bringing light down to 12 meters and more, natural light, so that you don't create that sense of claustrophobia. And that's what the facade outside looks like. It's all adjustable, so you can modulate it for the light and for the sun. And the base is in concrete. You can close it and adjust it, and that's how it relates to the rest of the buildings and the plaza. And that's the entrance. So it's a separated set of buildings. So the 3 buildings are clearly separated visually, creating these spaces in between, which are buffers, not only for the heat, but also for the rain. And they're bridges from every direction of the campus that connect you. So that way it became a focal building to allow this movement right through from the campus. And then you see the skylights at the bottom there. The ground floor is unprogrammed space for reviews and for exhibitions. And we aligned it perfectly to the original buildings by Doshi. So they kind of framed and spoke to that axis. And that's how you kind of enter the building. That's the exhibition gallery. And then you go down to the book stacks and the carrels, and you go up to the reading rooms and other areas. And so I'm going to now take you down into the building, and then I'll show you what's up there. So this is the -4 meter. That's the ground line. So the concrete goes from dark gray to, it gets lighter as you go under the building, so that the light kind of reflects. These are the carrels, the courtyards are outside, and the circulation, you can go out and meet, and now they have spaces for galleries here too, because this has become a popular space, so you don't disturb the library, you step outside it into this courtyard. And that's what I meant by, each of these have a different sectional logic. So from anywhere in the building, you can simultaneously see 3 or 4 levels. So your eye always moves on the diagonal. You don't get stratified in floors as you would normally when you go down into a basement. And this kind of depth, and you're always aware of natural light wherever you are. And these are the buildings within buildings, as I was saying. And this is just a kind of drone image which shows you, these are catwalks which have a harness cable channel there that you can adjust the louvers from. And as you go down into the building, this is the space. You see the concrete changing color. These are the bridges that connect you from different parts of the campus. The carrels and then the skylights, which take light even further. The concrete has got much lighter. That catches any rain that might drip through the louvers. And then when you come down, it's sort of, you see this is now -12 meters, and you kind of get natural light on the concrete. And this is the veranda, the courtyard outside, where you can circulate. Those are the stacks. You can see the different levels there. These are carrels for PhD students. You see these half levels because of the difference in the levels within the building. And then this is the bottom, where just these 3 portals make the structure. So there are no beams and columns. And everything is integrated in the stack. So except for the Wi-Fi monitor, there's nothing. You have concrete, and they're just rooms. It's very stark and silent in a sense. And when you go up, it's a completely different quality with light, with the louvers that can be adjusted. Now this has furniture and outdoor spaces where in the good weather you can actually have a conference or a class without disturbing the library. And the louvers can be adjusted, at will, depending on the line. It's also to make the student sensitive about the climate. So one of the things we produced in 2 languages, it was a whole operational manual. And now in the school, they use this building in the 3rd year for the climate class. The students have to actually monitor and map it, so they become aware of how the climate changes because they actually use the building. And that's how at night it kind of becomes transparent, so it has a completely different character and dimension. We purposely made these niches all along the base, which what students occupy. It's completely full of students. They eat lunch there, they work there. It's under shade, the concrete is cool, and you get this kind of play between the day and the night as the time changes. The second project is a corporate building for an infrastructure company. And they wanted a glass box. That was their brief. And we were kind of, in despair when we got the brief. Hyderabad is very hot and dry. And here the patrons actually collapse like a weekend home because you have someone who has a clear aspiration. These are all buildings in what are called Cyberabad, which is Hyderabad's cyber city. And every building here that you can see is glass. It's just sheer glass, except for this circular building, which Mario Botta did, so it's all brick. And we got this sort of site. And these guys actually, this is like NASA's control room. They have cameras on every piece of equipment across the country, and they sit here and they monitor how many hours people are putting in. Someone's gone for a long tea break. He gets a cell phone call, get back into your truck. So they're kind of control freaks. And so they wanted like a cutting-edge global building. While we were doing this building, there was also political rife in the state of Andhra Pradesh. They were trying to divide the state into Telangana. And so all these buildings, this is Mercedes-Benz, you can see that this is their showroom. All these buildings were great targets for rioters. You just throw stones and you shatter the glass, and people enjoyed doing that while the riots were going on. So curtain glazing manufacturers, when they sold you curtain glass, they sold you a selection, gave you an option of what fishing nets you could attach to it. And they worked out all the details for you. So if it was blue reflecting glass, you could pick blue fishing nets or white. And so it became part of the paraphernalia. And this made it really interesting because I thought, my God, these images that you connect to globalization and modernization are so compelling that people go to this extent to, maybe they were right because you could take the fishing nets off and now it's much safer. We were inspired by something quite different. And we were inspired by this little hut, which is a water cooler that in Jaipur, this guy works for the government and a business association that runs this. And he comes for work every day in the summer and puts a kettle out. People come and drink water, no plastic cups. You just cup your hand, you smile at the guy, and you get clean, cool water. And every once in a while, he comes out, when he begins to get a little warm, and he humidifies the hut. So through evaporative cooling, the hut stays cool. And within the hut, there are clay pots, which through, again, evaporative cooling, keep the water cool. It's a very beautifully made. There are about 100 of these that are put up all over Jaipur. For anyone who goes to Jaipur in May or June, you will see these there. And a business association runs it. Those are the pots, clean, safe water. And beautiful brass pot. That's all he has as terms of an investment. And it's such a lovely, beautiful gesture. Sustainability, my God, no plastic, no paper, nothing. It's just recyclable completely. And so we said, how can this inspire us to do a building? And the filtering of light, and it's just such a simple, temporary, reversible, dismantleable kind of thing. So we came up with a building that's like a 5-story building with a green facade. Now, this is not a green wall as when you stick buckets with plants as they do all over the place, and especially in airports, but this is a performative screen where you have a hydroponic tray, so it's very efficient in terms of water, and you have a misting system that's integrated in the facade that keeps the plants moist so the air can go through it. We couldn't get a LEED certificate because our windows were openable. We had to make them openable to have water come in, and the air come in. We didn't seal them. And so, of course, now India has a GREA standard which takes care for passive cooling and things like that. But anyway, we managed to convince the clients who were very young that we didn't need to do this. But every facade is different, so the same fantasies that people play out using Alico Bond and making patterns of colors and things we did with plants. And it was essentially 3 components. The building, which is a spec building, because this is Impatient capital. They wanted the building delivered in 9 months. We managed to negotiate with them that we'll take 3 years to grow the facade, and they agreed. And then we have a screen, which we've made in cast aluminum, and then the planting that comes on it. Every facade is different. We grew the plants in a nursery to test them. In 9 months, we gave them the building with the scaffolding. The cows went in to make the building sacred. The priests came in, did all their pujas, and they began using the building while we were growing the facade. And we grew the facade and made it in a small little factory with a contractor who said, if you give me 2 years or more, it's economical because I have to get only one mold. If you wanted it 6 months, I have to get 2 or 3 molds, and it doesn't make it economical for me because it's a very small contractor. So we agreed to that, the clients agreed, and then slowly the building got built with one mold. It's recycled aluminum, so that's why you see, and that's the mold, which in its profile also has space for the misting system. This is all the recycled biscuits of that's why they're so uneven. That's where the misting system goes, and that's the casting, so that you get a delicacy at the edge. They're very small panels that 1 or 2 people can lift. They're very light panels. There are women involved in the anodizing process. These are large anodizing tents, all very low tech. And then they store these, and whenever they have enough, a small truck comes, they fill it, and then 2 guys go and they assemble it, and that's how it aggregates to become the facade. And that's when it was just finished with the misting system, and you can, modulate it depending on what is growing where, because you don't want to kill the plants with overwatering it, and it keeps it very, very cool, and the misting keeps it warm. Cool, and you also can create atmosphere if you want it, but the plants don't need the water, and that's why it's fine misting, where the water gets also recycled through a channel at the base, which is here, so that you can kind of use it or reuse it, and that's some of the flowers as they began to grow. It becomes like a woolly monster, then you have to give it a haircut, cut it back, it grows again. And the idea was that the facade should look integral even if it doesn't have growth. So it's a very simple idea, but it was hard to execute. The parking is all below the base, and the base itself is a garden for people to kind of socialize. It's a series of courtyards that also draw out the hot air. So there are many other principles that we kind of played out in the building. And this is the atrium. So this is the tendering department, so that has total privacy. This is the corporate office, and that's cafeterias and an auditorium and all sorts of kinds of things. So even sectionally, it's modulated. It's not a spec building as a spec building. And that guy's across the road from us, and he got a LEED certificate. It's like the walkie-talkie building because they don't consider the public sphere and what that does to the heat islands around the building. And we are now trying to monitor it. We did this very intuitively, I must admit. It wasn't a scientific process. And that's what the ornament comes from, the shadows. And I come back to this image. And this is an image which now means a lot to me. This is an image that a young intern from Panama City who happened to be working with us and wanted to visit the building took. It's not a staged photograph. But why it became important to me in reflection, so this is not something we planned for, and I come back to the emblem of soft thresholds, is, that woman wouldn't have been wearing a sari. These guys would have been squatting on their haunches outside the building, tending the garden, while the CEO would have driven past in an Audi with reflective glass, no connection between the small economic players and the large corporate players. But now the gardeners, there are 20 of them, the identity of the building depends on them. If the facade doesn't bloom, this building looks pathetic. They're the lowest paid economic players in this corporation. But they can walk free because of these catwalks anywhere. They can look into the boss's cabin. And that has created an amazingly unexpected level of empathy within the corporation. Because we've got blinds everywhere, but no one puts their blinds down. Actually, they make friends with the gardeners. They've become the heroes of the buildings. They ask them for bouquets. It's our anniversary. I've forgotten to buy flowers for my wife. They make bouquets for them. They catch butterflies for their kids. They've become an integral part of that corporation. Now, honestly, we didn't plan for this, but we are observing this, and this is making us understand how architecture can actually be really instrumental if you have to address these issues in these sort of small ways. And I'm going to forward this a bit because this is something last June, after 10 years, before the Venice Biennale, I said, let me go and see what the building feels like now. And these are the old footages which I've already shown you. And then we went and did another kind of documentation of the building. And this is in May, early June, when it was at its peak in terms of heat. That's why you see some parts have kind of burnt out, but it's actually become rather dense. The roof is all solar panels so that you also get energy through that. These are the conference rooms where the glass protrudes out. But this is now how the building is after 10 or 12 years of its sort of existence. It stayed intact. That relationship with the gardeners has stayed intact, and it continues to, in some ways, flourish. This next project is trying to use these principles in a building we've done in Europe for Novartis. It's on the Novartis campus, which was designed by Vittorio Lumpagnani. It's a very conservative, rigorous kind of site plan on the Rhine River. We were very lucky. They've got architects from different countries. We were chosen to do a building for them. So that's what it looks like. Our building is right here. He kind of, like I said, it's a really rigorous site plan. He was left with a triangle, so he gave it to Frank Gehry, but the rest was sort of very kind of disciplined. The codes were very, very strict. There was very little you can do. And it's a process and project in process. They're pulling down old buildings and building us. So we are here on the river now. Of course, this garden has got done. And that's the principle we used here, where we took the laboratories. This is called the Lab of the Future. We took public functions. We took places for the office, administrating, scientists, and gardens. And so what we did was took the idea of a courtyard and zoning, and instead of horizontally organizing it, organized it volumetrically and sectionally. Now, this was very interesting for a couple of reasons. One was that of the 20 buildings there done by all the really famous architects, this is what they were given. They were given a footprint within the guidelines, and they were given the cores. So this is the elevators, the ducts, the air conditioning, the piping for the labs. And so the labs came in the center, and all the offices for the scientists went around. And you began to create hierarchies here, just in ways you gave people access to light, or you gave them access to the staircases, etc. Hierarchy, and actually in a subtle way, when we analyzed this, I may be coming from India or whatever, we became very sensitive to this, and we said we've got to challenge this paradigm, and that was a nightmare. In Switzerland, you have about 50 consultants. We have consultants that tell you about how high the desk should be, how low it should be. It's an affluent society. So to try to get a paradigm shift there was mind-boggling, but we persisted. And we managed to convince them that this should be the organization. We should fragment the cores so that you have many possibilities of circulation, and this is where the ducts should go for the scientists, so that we could organize the zones that we sort of proposed for the building, because we felt that would create a more social atmosphere. And the other thing we did, again, which nobody had challenged, this is the volumetric guidelines, we said that, look, if we want to carve a courtyard out here, the way we'll compensate it is that the administrative areas don't need 4 meters of height. You can do 2.4 for an office and it would work, which means we could get 5 or 6 floors here and only 4 or 5 floors there, and that we could carve out in terms of the FAR as a courtyard. 2 simple moves which completely changed the paradigm for them. And I think, I don't know, in India we are used to finding loopholes in everything because the laws are so strict that, my instinct was, how can I do a building and not challenge the laws or find a loophole? And so this is what we did. So this is a section of the building. That's the ducts for the scientific stuff. That's where the scientists can write up their findings. These are the labs. This is the courtyard, the stairs that bring you up. And these are the offices and the administrators. This does 2 things. One, because of the staircases, you have huge possibilities of where you can move. So the social interaction, also because you can visually see each other, and it's only a half a flight between the labs and the offices. So as a social condenser, it has worked beautifully. And again, these are things you intuit, and you're very pleased when it does happen. And this is a garden in the center conceived by Gunther Woh, who's a Swiss landscape architect, and we also use the facade, but here he used 28 species, which actually become a register for the seasons. So it's more about registering the seasons. That's what it looks like at night. That's the riverside, which has blinds actually, and these are large verandas. That's what it looks like. This is a concrete kind of facade. That's a building designed by Markey, which is just white glass. This is the entrance, the ducts. You go up these staircases, the labs. This is the stair which you can see the river as you come in with conference spaces. Just taking you through it very quickly. That's the upper floor where you have the office, you have the garden, and you have the lab. So in the plan, it seems like 3 or 4 very clear zones, but in reality, it completely blurs. So that's the offices that go out into the garden. These are the meeting rooms, which are merely decks, and those are the labs. So everyone can access these common spaces with just 8 or 9 steps in another kind of level, looking out at the Rhine River. The labs, which are designed by Toshiko Mori. The furniture has been designed by Toshiko Mori. And this is the labs, the garden, the administrative people, lots of public space. So that became the emphasis. These are the half flights you do between different zones. And of course, this also warms and cools the building, which I don't want to get into right now. But here you have meeting zones. You can sit in a forest and get lost. You can yet see the river. You have monitors so you can have meetings and seminars. And that's the relationship between the labs and the river and the administrators. So huge contact and huge porosity as you go through the building, and different views are framed, and that's what it looks like. I'm going to reverse this with 2 projects, and I'll go very quickly because I think I'm running out of time. So these projects were about taking really global programs and trying to localize them. That means to root them in a place, to make them invested in a locality. So the reverse is interesting. How do you take very specifically local programs, which might be related to the informal, to slums, to poverty, and how do you actually make them resonate globally in terms of the lessons you... So this inversion is important because otherwise we land up making a caricature of the local. So we say, oh, it's a, and it's like a program which has to do with some rural aspect. You say, let's make it like a village. How do you abstract? And I think modernism can teach you how the abstraction of these principles can become... Now here, this gets actually very complicated because here, the projects I'm going to show you, the patrons, the clients, and the users never meet each other. They don't even know who the other is. And therefore, the role of the architect becomes really critical because you are the one that has to make those feedback loops. And I think that awareness was sort of really critical. So let me look at the sanitation project, which is what Dharavi or many places in India look like. Massive problem of sanitation. Open defecation. I mean, in Mumbai, for example, open defecation is everywhere in most parts of India. And the towns that I was talking about, the 27,000 places of 10 to 15 to 100,000 people that don't get classified as towns don't even have the sanitation infrastructure. So open defecation is huge. Just some statistics. If you look at this map of the world, India has the world's highest open defecation. It's mind-boggling. And if you break it down by, so this megacity I was talking about, this agrarian field is massive open defecation because again, nothing there gets defined or classified as a town. So these readings actually, I mean, the readings I was showing you about spatializing urban India has a huge bearing on even a project like this when you're trying to look at sanitation as infrastructure. So Mumbai, the UN says we have 1 toilet for 1,440 people. It's just mind-boggling. Forget what the NGO we worked with says, what the Bombay Municipal Corporation said, but the Bombay Municipal Corporation's target is 1 toilet for 50 people, which means 6 families will have to share a toilet, which means you'll have a lottery. You'll be lucky if once a week you can use the toilet. So even to have an aspiration like that is totally pathetic, And so this is an interesting image that I accidentally took. This child going to school, white socks, smile on his face, probably defecated in the open when he got out of his house to go to school, completely intact otherwise. I mean, our children, you can relate this to kids you have. And I mean, what people go, a whole generation goes through this. So it's like not only a public health problem, but it's just pathetic. The Prime Minister of India, I think this is noble among many other things many other things we criticize him about, is that he said he's going to construct a toilet in every household by 2019. We are already there. And, they claim to have done 2 million homes, but I'll show you how. And it's bizarre because here we are thinking in absolute terms, absolute solutions. We need 20 million toilets, let's have 20 million toilets, set up a factory, prefab them, and dump them where you have to. And so how can you get a toilet to every house here? It's impossible. This is what they do. Now studies have shown they take them to villages and they leave them out, make a septic tank, which clogs up very quickly. The honey wagon can't come to clean it. These toilets are the they're the strongest, most pakka or most permanent structure in the entire village. So now studies have shown that no one uses them as toilets. They store grain there, jewelry, their luggage. It's like it's the safe of the house. And there are actual studies that have documented this, so it's bizarre. Now this is an example of an absolute solution, and I go back to what I was saying. How do we think about transition? So clearly, if we have to get a toilet here, we have to first make the transition to community toilets. We've got to change the culture, we've got to change habits, we've got to hope that we can solve the housing problem by diversifying into other modes, looking at the metropolitan region of Mumbai, having housing that's much cheaper, and people have sanitation. And so they'd make public toilets. And that's where we got involved, and we said, look, we've got to rethink the public toilet. And we came up with this idea where you separate men and women, so you have 2 floors, so it's much safer because that's a huge issue. We use this green wall idea that the toilet suddenly becomes aesthetic, and ideologues like us, architects, we thought, I would say, my God, imagine if people go and pluck a flower from this facade off the toilet before they go to pray. And of course, that doesn't happen. We made a very big change, which actually was our undoing, which is we said that the toilet's caretaker, the person who cleans the toilet, who's the lowest caste, should get a house on top of the toilet so they can actually feel connected to the toilet. And then from a client, because this was a World Bank funded project, I got money for solar panels so we could get it off the grid so kids could study in this common space. So we kind of imagined it as this kind of hybrid community center. Many presentations we made, and this one started, and at the foundation level, the government stopped it. So I went to meet the municipal commissioner. He said, you're making an iconic building. What's this? So I said, what do you mean by iconic building? They said, we've worked out a deal with the developer. We're going to get rid of the slums. We're going to do buildings here, and in one block, we're going to house the slum dwellers. And you're going to give them a community space. They're going to organize them socially. They're going to come and stop this, so you can't have a toilet like this. So anyway, we had many failures for those reasons. We made them of different scales. We finally went to a very remote location in one of the slums and said, let's build it, where we knew the roads were so bad that even the municipal engineers wouldn't go there on their motorbikes. So we said, let's build it there. Now, this was the impatience of an architect. But anyway, I built it with this NGO. This is the community space. That's the public housing that the slum dwellers haven't moved into for 20 years because it's so inappropriate. So these are places that are going to stay, just to prove that point. Kids began to use it. The solar panels were up. It became iconic in some ways. But then when I went back 6 months later, I realized it had become a club for the men. That's a little TV for cricket. There are lots of rum bottles lying around, and the government built another toilet. And of course, the short version of this story is that I had not understood my clients, actually. I had imagined the patrons, which was the World Bank, who gave us the norms, but the clients who were the local organizers, actually the leaders, very corrupt political leaders of the slum, had used the money as a construction ploy and had now privatized it. And so it was like suddenly, and I wasn't talking about the patron, client, and user so clearly when I did this project. This is in reflection. And so, of course, Beckett comes to mind, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And so this was a competition for the Gates Foundation. We won the first prize, where we embedded it even more in the community. We made it in steel so it could be dismantled and reversed if conditions changed. We put a laundromat into it. We made it a place where you could buy supplies like soap and bottled water at cheap prices, so that you could make it a hub of sanitation, not just a community toilet. And we provocatively put it across the temple. And anyway, I won't go more into this. I'll just end this project by saying, now this has become a research project that I'm doing, and the question I'm asking, that's the symbol of the GSD, is in this complex ecology of the Swachh Bharat mission, which is the sanitation mission, how do us in the academy or NGOs, where do we situate ourselves? We are actually usually in the periphery, the Tata Trusts or the South Asia Institute at Harvard. I see the Graduate School of Design here, but we're yet at the edge of the private sector. How do we penetrate this ecology? And unless we do that, we can't make this intersection between the spheres of our concern and those of our influence. I'm going to end with this project as quickly as I can. Here are my clients. In this case, the users were very clear. This is a project outside Jaipur for 100 elephants and their mahouts. Mahouts are the people who look after elephants, and they are Muslim. And Rajasthan is a right-wing Hindu state, so they get kind of marginalized. They get paid very little. They get paid 5,000 rupees, which is less than $100. They look after this magnificent animal, who you can see is in bad shape. Their skin gets discolored, etc. So we won this competition. Elephants came there accidentally. This is from the New York Times. They came there because tourists, it became part of the narrative of seeing these places. The Mughals bought them there, or the Maharajas bought them there for ceremony, pomp, battle. But this is a desert climate. These are tropical beings. They should be in Kerala, Sri Lanka, Thailand, which is where they thrive. But they happen to be here. They take tourists up. Their faces get painted with these toxic paints. They have no water to clean it. That's why you get that discoloring. This is what the government had done for them. The elephants live here. The caretakers were supposed to live on top. They all moved down here because that relationship of the caretaker to the elephant is really complex, because this is a beast that can go out of control. And so the proximity becomes very critical. Anyway, and we, of course, made it a project around water. How would you capture the water? So it was a landscape project. We didn't privilege architecture, created a series of micro dams in our proposal of how we would capture the water. We studied it on Google. This was some buildings that were remnants on the site, which we later retrofitted into a school. And this was the site given to us. We could see water was passing through it. And therefore, the project became a series of micro dams that would capture the water. And in the space that was not used for the landscape is where we would place the actual housing unit. So we reversed the priority on it, and that became the site plan. So that's how, when we got the site in 2007, that hill, it's the same hill. In 3 years, that's what we transformed it to. And it got abandoned because the government fell, and the Congress government, and the BJP government that started the project, as soon as the Congress came to power, they said, we don't have anything to the project. We were very frustrated, but it actually worked because it allowed the landscape to regenerate itself, because we managed to excavate this large water body. And now in 17, which is 10 years later, that's the same hill. And so you see it's a completely transformed landscape. And this became a case in terms of our learning not to privilege architecture, to actually privilege the landscape. But of course, we did design this carefully. We got away from the row houses to make clusters. It's only 400 square feet of family. And so it's 400 square feet with a courtyard. So that already becomes about 600 or 700 square feet, a shed for the elephant, and then a shared courtyard. So if you divide this, it actually is 1,200 square foot. So the poor suddenly, surreptitiously, we managed to give them much more space. And of course, we used very sound principles of insulation, how the food could be stored, how air would move, so that in this harsh climate, you began to get it. And of course, this is what a site visit looked like. And the reason we did this was because, elephants come in different sizes, and they can't lie on flat ground because they can't get up. So you've actually got to, based on their size, have an inclination. They usually sleep on berms because they're too large to get up. If they get flat, or it goes negative. And so that's really interesting. And so we had to do these mock-ups to see how they would be comfortable, because there's a budget in terms of size. And this is... we haven't yet done a book on our projects, and I always say this jokingly, that this will be the cover image, and our book is also going to be called Large, Medium, Small, and Extra Large. So this is what it sort of looks like. That's Amber, where they work, the first water body, and these are interesting sheds, which I'll tell you about. But the project got abandoned. And when the BJP government came back a few years ago, we began to lobby with them. And luckily, they picked up on it. The Congress did a little bit, but it was very contested. But that's what it looks like. These are the courtyards. Elephants can look and play with the children, because they're kind of dangerous for the children, but they kind of hang out and observe what's happening. That's what a shed looks like. It's not plastered because they didn't get ownership, and I'll come to that in a second, and that's what the clusters look like. Different people do different things with their clusters. Here's a guy coming home. You can see the incline, happy family. What's interesting, again, by default, not what we designed, by default, you have an inversion here, because in Jaipur, even the rich and the middle class buy tanks of water every day because there's a water shortage. But here, the poorest in that community, who are marginalized, now have more water than what they need. So they grow flowers, they sell flowers, they have lawns. The lawns are like the dream for the middle class when they have a bungalow. But here, the poorest actually have green lawns that they don't have to worry about. And because they have a surplus of water. So you get an inversion in this kind of equity question, again by default. Again, a power of architecture, and I must admit, these are all on reflection. So, and life corrodes architecture, and life really corrodes housing. And now the outsides are used for kitchens, the goats have arrived, the trees have grown. It's kind of populated and getting corroded. Some communities work better together. In this case, this is a set of, there are 3 families with lots of kids. They're looking for dinner, I guess. And that's an image of before and after. That's the view from the same spot. That's the same hill. And you see the transformation just because of the availability of water. The dish antennas have arrived, which is, again, a sign of stable lives and homes. You know what elephants look like. I don't need to show you that video. But here, another thing by default. You see the discoloring. What water has done is incredible because it has changed their life. But what it has done, again by default, we didn't realize this, is the bonding between the mahout and the elephant. Because of the availability of water and them actually, this is very comforting for the elephant. And this helps their relationship enormously. Again, something we've understood in reflection. And so, there are many lessons like this, which, of course, you can reflect about and you don't know. And, of course, this is local kikar species, and now we've got little budgets to line the water bodies. And just this last story about the pavilion. So elephants are also social beings. They have to hang out with their buddies. If you leave them alone for too long, they begin to get rogue. So these mahouts organize like these, sit-outs in a sense. So they get their different elephants and they hang out in these pavilions. Now, the new generation there, who are teenagers, savvy with social media, saw this as an opportunity. So they started a company called Elephantastic. They've got a website. You can go there. On TripAdvisor, you can find it. They charge you, I think, 200 rupees to feed the elephant. They charge you 500 rupees to have a bath with the elephant. So they've started a whole economy out of recognizing the potential of this. And there you are. That's Elephantastic. And they've got this business going. And tourists just flock there, especially the young. And, when we recently did an exhibition, I kind of mapped the timeline. And these are the different letters I've written to the government. There are about 120 letters. I've just got a few here. And showing what you see is these are the political parties in power. The BJP, the Green is Congress, BJP comes back. These black lines are the different agencies. So for 6 months, the Amber Development Authority was in charge of this. Then the Rajasthan Tourism was in charge of this. So the operational client kept changing, and we had to interface with them. The steady ones were the mahouts and the elephants. And the red line shows our involvement, except for a few years where we didn't engage so much because we were exhausted. And then we re-engaged when the new government said they'd finish the project. We were perhaps the only consistent line in this process over 10 or 12 years. And I think because we had a rapport with the users and we had the access to the patrons, which were the chief ministers, and we had a rapport we had uneven rapports with the operational client, we managed to kind of really pull the project through. And it was really interesting that the University of Ferrara, about 4 years ago, out of the blue, we got the gold medal for the most sustainable project that year. And it was to this project. It was like out of the blue, literally. And Glenn Murcutt, the famous architect, was the chair of that jury. So I wrote to the chief minister with the image of the gold medal saying we got this. And I got a call from her. And that's what made the project finish. Vasundhara Raje was her name. And she just lost the election. So now no one will look after it for another 3 years till a new government perhaps comes to play. But that's what it looks like when it was abandoned. Now it's getting finished. These are the different pavilions being made, more housing being added. Those are more drinking troughs so that you can have more pavilions. You can see how the trees have grown from what was completely barren. There's a gateway and a visitor center where you can now modulate how many tourists come into the place, many other infrastructural problems. This is what we renovated, those broken houses, into a school. We created a guest house which has 4 rooms and around a courtyard, very discreet, and a dining facility for scholars who want to study conservation. So it's very low-key there. You can live there, but you can also access the village. So from the outside, you don't see anything. It's very neutral, very simply done. That woman is from the Rajasthan Tourism Department. She's training the wives of the mahouts, and you can see from their dress, they're all Muslim, to cook and clean, and so they run the guest house, and it gives them an income. Now, this wasn't part of the project brief. We managed to convince the government this would be kind of worth doing, again, made out of very simple materials. I was saying to you, the houses weren't plastered or painted because they didn't own it. The moment they began to own it, they started painting and plastering it. And I went back. We planted 5,000 trees before the last monsoon. There are sticks here, but now they've grown. And I asked them, I said, I thought you'd paint these beautiful elephants and from the Shekhawati murals and things. And they said, no. They said the main thing that has happened here, and a lot of tourists are coming because of the water, the bird population has become amazing. So everyone who is now living in that guest house are people who are coming to observe and study the birds. And so the villagers, the mahouts picked up on that, and what they began to actually represent were not the elephants which were there, but the birds. Again, an interesting unintended consequences. So these are many unintended consequences that if we can create the feedback loops in our mind to capture them, I think it's very productive for architecture. And this is the school that we made out of those broken buildings. And now you have another generation that lives there. I'm going to just reflect on this by quoting someone called Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University. And, he said something writing about inequity and equity, and he said, I'm quoting him, "In a society riven by deep inequity, there's not even a minimal basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes human beings almost different species in each other's eyes. Why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation and the darkness and the sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of the social hierarchy might really be like. The very thing you would expect to instigate the questions of justice actually makes it hard to raise them." End of quote. And that's what makes, I think, these projects, but also for us as architects to look at them in what their global resonance would be, not to caricature them, might be a way for us to transcend this gap that actually empowers us when we deal with difficult projects like this. And so I just want to end on one note that I think imagining the simultaneous validity of difference is critical. Looking at different strategies in ways we can address these problems which have an implication on the architecture of practice, not the practice of architecture, of course that comes from it, but how we design our practice becomes critical to engage with this range. And I think our being open to the idea of engaging across the spectrum, because we shouldn't construct the binaries and then choose to live in one of the worlds that we set up in the binaries. But I think our role as architects and people who mold the spatial environment is to create feedback loops that we can blur this binary, because that really is the biggest power, I think, and potential of design. And I think I would say both pedagogy and the practice is in this crisis. And as Paul Romer from the World Bank said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm really over time. I'm happy to do questions or talk
We have
outside.
time for 2 questions. And so, okay, there's one. And do we have a second? Okay, 1 question.
As I hope you realized, we all found your talk absolutely fascinating, so thank you.
Thank you.
In a city where homelessness is so present, how have you started to imagine easing that inequity?
Oh, gosh. Okay, right. One.
That's an easy question.
Well, no, I would actually answer it another way, which is that I think, what is happening around the world, and you blame neoliberalism and all of that, we can't talk about planning or housing without the state's involvement. I think this devolvement of the state in primary forms of infrastructure, housing included, is critical. The whole world is suffering from this. I mean, in India, it's an acute problem. I mean, the prime minister there, in this the PAYS, the Pradhan Mantri Ayojan, promised what and that we surfaced it in our housing exhibition, that the deficit that we have of, 20, I don't know, however million, 12 something million, 14 million houses or something, were going to be completed by 2019 before the election. When you do a back of the envelope calculation, at the pace that they're going right now, they'll take about 120 years to do that, about maybe 130 years to do that if you use that pace. And even what has been done is situated, so it's affordable housing. So what do? You go like way out of the city and find the cheapest land and build affordable housing, which has no linkage to mobility, to jobs, to livelihood, to the ecology that makes the urban, right? And only the state can orchestrate that. Now, within this neoliberal thinking and the failure of the state and things, we have to think of new hybrid organizational patterns where the private sector can be involved, but the state can't devolve its responsibility. And I think this is evenly happening across the globe. And I think one of the things that's being affected most by this is primary infrastructure, both social as well as physical. When I say social, I mean public health related, and I mean schools and education. And physical, I mean housing and mobility and all of that. And so that, the state has to be involved. And whether it means doling out, whether it means working out public-private partnerships, there's a whole gamut of ways we can look at it. There is really no other way, because the state should and can control a chunk of the land. In India, we have the classic example of New Bombay, Navi Mumbai, which now called Navi Mumbai, where the government, for the first time, I think, in the history of urban planning, owned land for a city of 3 million people. And if you look at what's happened now, they've just sold all that out. That means they can never control planning again. They've given one industrialist like half that land, So what does that mean? And you can't have cities. And so Bombay is imploding because this chance of it diversifying into more complicated and more diverse modes, in a sense, of the region and metropolitan is lost, because now the private sector controls that, and they only want to, that's this horrible word that everyone uses, how do we monetize land? So when you begin to monetize land, then you don't have urban planning, you don't have housing, you don't have the ecology that allows you to address the questions that I think you've raised. I don't know San Francisco well enough, so I can't answer it more pointedly. It's more a general response, so sorry about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. I'm sorry to end it there. But thank you, Rahul. It was amazing.
No, thank you very much. Yeah.